Imagine you're trying to build the energy grid of the future. You are deploying these massive solar farms across the deserts, you're spinning up next-generation nuclear plants,
Right.
and you're pushing millions of electric vehicles onto the roads. But there is this massive, unavoidable catch. Like nearly 75% of your country's lights are still kept on by burning coal.
Yeah, it's a massive contradiction.
It really is. And today, we are deep diving into what might literally be the most complex math problem on Earth. How do you pull over 1 billion people into the global middle class without basically setting the atmosphere on fire to do it?
I mean, it is the defining geopolitical and, frankly, engineering challenge of our time. You are looking at a scenario where environmental policy, it can't just be outsourced to a single government department anymore.
Right, it's not just the Environment Ministry's problem.
Exactly. It is the absolute core of a nation's economic survival and national security.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are analyzing India's newly updated Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, for the years 2031 to 2035. These were officially announced in March 2026.
Yeah.
And our mission here today is to unpack these incredibly ambitious new targets for you. We want to understand the vast machinery of government policy driving them. And crucially, we're going to look really hard at the very real roadblocks standing in the way.
Because the roadblocks are significant.
Hmm.
And to really grasp the gravity of this document, you have to look at the guiding vision behind these targets. The sources explicitly anchor India's climate strategy to this concept of Viksit Bharat.
Right, which translates to a fully developed India by 2047.
Right, a fully developed India by 2047. And that reframes this entire conversation for you. Sustainability is not being viewed as like a burden imposed by the West or the international community.
Yeah.
It's viewed as a foundational pillar of their own development. Because, you simply cannot become a secure, fully developed nation by 2047 if your coastlines are drowning and your agriculture is collapsing under heat waves.
That makes total sense. So let's get into the actual scoreboard. Before we look at how India plans to rewire its economy, we need to understand the numbers they are actually promising to hit.
Memory layer, if you
Yeah,
were.
the hard data. So the NDCs outline 3 main quantitative targets. Let's start with the first one. India is pledging to achieve 60% of its cumulative installed electricity capacity from non-fossil sources by 2035.
So that's your solar, your wind, hydro, and nuclear.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's the statistic that jumped out at me from our notes. As of February 2026, they had already reached 52.57%.
Which is an incredible acceleration, honestly. Their previous international pledge was to hit 50% by 2030.
And they crossed that line 4 years ahead of schedule.
Yeah, way ahead.
But let me push back on that slightly. Because if they are already at almost 53% today, isn't setting a target of 60% by 2035 actually playing it kind of safe? I mean, it seems like a pretty modest bump for a 10-year runway.
It sounds modest, sure, until you factor in the sheer scale of the denominator here.
What do you mean by the denominator?
Well, India's economy is growing so fast that its total energy demand is just skyrocketing. Maintaining that 50+% ratio while simultaneously doubling or tripling the overall size of the grid, it requires a staggering amount of new clean energy deployment.
Oh, wow. Right.
Yeah, the law of diminishing returns kicks in hard. Finding the land, building the transmission lines, funding those massive projects, it gets exponentially harder as the grid itself gets larger.
Okay, that makes sense. You aren't just replacing old capacity. You're trying to outpace this explosive new demand.
Which brings us to target 2. Reducing the emissions intensity of their GDP by 47% by 2035 compared to 2005 levels.
Now, for the listener who might not read climate policy reports every day, let's clarify what emissions intensity actually is.
Yeah, the easiest way to visualize emissions intensity is to think about fuel efficiency in a car. India is not saying they're going to stop driving.
Right, they can't.
Exactly. They have a massive developing economy. They actually need to drive further and faster to lift millions of people out of poverty. But what they are promising is to upgrade from, say, a heavy gas-guzzling truck to a highly efficient hybrid engine.
So the economy continues to grow, but the amount of pollution generated per dollar of GDP drops significantly.
You've got it. That's the structural problem being solved.
Okay, that clarifies the mechanism. But I want to look at the difficulty of this 47% target, because India already achieved a 36% reduction by 2020.
Yes, they did.
And they grabbed the low-hanging fruit to do that, right? Upgrading the most inefficient factories, standardizing LED light bulbs, things like that.
Yeah.
Going from 36 to 47% feels to me Exactly like trying to lose the last 5 stubborn pounds of a weight loss goal.
That is a perfect analogy.
Like, losing the first 10 pounds just takes cutting out soda, but losing the last 5 requires fundamentally restructuring your entire lifestyle and metabolism.
That is precisely the challenge they're facing. To get to 47%, you can no longer rely on easy efficiency tweaks. You have to start decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors.
Like cement and steel.
Cement manufacturing, steel production,
Yeah.
heavy freight transport, those require massive technological leaps, not just better light bulbs.
Right.
And that structural difficulty leads us directly to target 3, creating an additional carbon sink of 3.5 to 4.0 billion tons of CO2 equivalent through enhanced forest and tree cover by 2035.
And for context on that one for you listening, as of 2025, they had created a sink of 2.29 billion tons. So they are attempting to nearly double that impact in just a decade.
It's a huge jump.
It is. But when you look at all 3 of these targets combined, there is a foundational diplomatic principle mentioned in our sources that seems to justify how India is pacing itself. It's an acronym. CBDRRC. Common, but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities.
Yeah, CBDRRC, it is arguably the most important concept in international climate negotiations today.
Break that down for us.
It's basically the argument that while climate change is a common crisis facing the entire globe, the responsibility to fix it is differentiated. It acknowledges who historically pumped the most carbon into the atmosphere during their industrial revolutions.
To developed nations.
Right. And it also looks at what financial resources a country currently possesses to actually manage the transition.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though. When developed nations hear differentiated responsibilities, does that just sound like, diplomatic cover for developing nations to say, hey, we get a free pass to keep polluting because you guys did it first?
It is heavily criticized exactly that way in some circles. But the economic reality is much more complex than that. It's fundamentally about the carbon budget inequity.
Okay.
India houses over 1.4 billion people. Millions still need reliable access to basic energy, to healthcare, to infrastructure. So CBDRRC is essentially India stating, we will absolutely do our part to transition, but our targets must harmonize with our national realities.
They can't just shut off the power.
Right, they cannot implement policies that trigger mass poverty just to meet an arbitrary global deadline.
Yeah.
It balances global climate duties with their absolute right to domestic economic survival.
And that balance, I think, dictates their entire action plan, because setting these massive targets on paper is one thing, but how does a government actually rewire the economy of 1.4 billion people without stalling the engine entirely?
It takes a massive institutional framework.
Yeah, our sources detail what they call a whole-of-government and a whole-of-society approach. They aren't just leaving this to the environmental regulators to figure out.
Not at all. They are embedding climate mechanisms into the very core of their economic and industrial policy. Take the green hydrogen mission, for example.
I've seen that mentioned a lot.
Yeah. Green hydrogen is created by using renewable energy to split water molecules. That gives you a clean burning fuel that can power those heavy industries we talked about earlier.
The steel and shipping.
Exactly, where traditional solar panels just fall short. India is aiming to become a global hub for this fuel, essentially turning a climate necessity into a massive export industry.
Wow. And they are also restructuring the consumer side of things, too.
Yes.
The documents highlight PM Surya Ghar, the Muft Bijli Yojana, which translates to a free electricity scheme via rooftop solar.
Right.
They are subsidizing the installation of solar panels on millions of homes. But the mechanism that really caught my eye in the sources is PM Koyusum, which targets the agricultural sector.
Oh, PM Kusum is a masterclass in aligning climate goals with rural economics. Historically, farmers relied on highly polluting diesel pumps to irrigate their fields.
Right, and a traditional, blunt force policy would just ban diesel pumps, which would instantly bankrupt the farmer.
Exactly. You destroy their livelihood.
Yeah.
Instead, under PM COUS, the government heavily subsidizes the purchase of a solar-powered water pump.
Okay.
But here is the genius mechanism. If the farmer generates extra solar power when they aren't actively irrigating, they can sell that excess electricity back to the national grid.
Oh, wow. So you have just transformed a subsistence farmer into a mini energy entrepreneur.
Precisely. You solve the emissions problem while actively creating a brand new income stream for rural citizens.
That is a massive shift in incentives. And they are doing something similar for heavy manufacturing, right? With the production-linked incentives or PLI schemes.
Yes, the PLI schemes are crucial.
Instead of just giving companies money up front to research green technology, the government subsidizes the actual physical output. You only get the financial reward if you successfully manufacture and sell domestic solar panels or EV batteries.
It completely forces the market to deliver on the promises.
Right. Now, alongside these economic mechanisms, there is a heavy push into advanced technologies. The sources detail a commitment to expanding nuclear energy capabilities and implementing CCUS carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Yeah, CCUS is a big one.
Let me stop you at CCUS, though, because I hear carbon capture thrown around a lot. And frankly, a lot of critics argue it's just, a sci-fi pipe dream, like it's designed to give coal plants an excuse to stay open. What is the actual mechanism here?
It's a fair critique, but the mechanism is real. Think of it like a highly advanced chemical sponge placed directly inside the smokestack of a factory or a power plant.
Okay.
Before the carbon dioxide can escape into the atmosphere, the system captures it, compresses it into a liquid, and then either utilizes it to make synthetic fuels or pumps it deep underground into secure geological formations.
But is it actually viable at scale?
Well, is it incredibly expensive and technologically difficult right now? Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
But for industries like cement, where the chemical process itself releases CO2 regardless of the energy source you use, CCUS is currently one of the only viable ways to decarbonize.
Got it. And we also have to talk about adaptation here, because mitigation, cutting emissions, that only stops future warming. Adaptation deals with the extreme weather that is already locked in.
And India is highly vulnerable to that.
Exactly. The sources highlight the MIS-HTI initiative, which focuses on mangrove restoration along India's massive coastline. And they aren't just planting mangroves because they look nice.
No, mangroves are essentially nature's shock absorbers. Their dense, complex root systems physically break the kinetic energy of storm surges.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, when you have thousands of miles of vulnerable coastline facing increasingly severe cyclones, a mangrove forest acts as a biological seawall, and it's far cheaper and more resilient than pouring billions of tons of concrete.
But this brings up a logistical nightmare for me. Top-down policies, PLI schemes, advanced carbon capture, those are great at the macro level. But how do you get everyday citizens to actually care?
That's the challenge of capacity building.
Right, because if I'm worried about my next paycheck, a billion-ton carbon sink target means absolutely nothing to me.
That is the exact vulnerability of top-down policy, and is exactly why India relies on everyday survival programs to deliver climate resilience. They use things like the Jal Jeevan mission, which aims to provide piped water to rural households, and soil health cards for farmers.
So tying it to daily needs.
Right. When you teach a farmer to optimize their soil, or you build centralized water infrastructure so women don't have to walk miles during severe drought, you are inherently building climate adaptation into their daily survival.
The documents also emphasize a specific cultural principle called lifestyle for environment. They essentially want to turn sustainable living into a mass movement.
Yes, behavioral change.
The prime example in our sources is the Ekped Maki Nam initiative, which urges citizens to plant a tree in the name of their mother. Now, I have to be slightly skeptical here.
Sure.
Attaching deep emotional and cultural resonance to a tree planting drive sounds lovely, but does a citizen-led campaign like that actually move the needle on a macroeconomic target of 4 billion tons, or is it just really excellent public relations?
Look, it is certainly good PR. But you cannot discount the strategic utility of cultural buy-in. In a chaotic, vibrant democracy of 1.4 billion people, top-down mandates often fail because they feel punitive.
Like the government is just punishing you.
Exactly. By framing environmental action as a cultural honor to one's family, you bypass a lot of that bureaucratic resistance. It won't hit the 4 billion ton target entirely on its own, but it creates the social license the government needs to execute the larger, more disruptive structural changes.
Speaking of disruptive structural changes, this is where we need a severe reality check in this analysis. Because if we don't look at the implementation gaps, we aren't really doing a deep dive.
We have to look at the challenges.
Let's look at the generation gap. We celebrated earlier that nearly 53% of India's installed capacity comes from non-fossil sources.
Yes.
But the data in the sources shows those same green sources only account for about 25% of the actual electricity generated.
Yeah.
If half the power plants are green, why are they only producing a quarter of the actual power?
Because installed capacity and actual generation are two very different metrics governed by basic physics. Capacity is what a solar farm can produce at absolute maximum, say, at noon on a perfectly clear, cloudless day.
Okay.
Generation is what it actually produces over a full 24-hour cycle.
Right, because the sun sets and the wind stops blowing. Intermittency.
Precisely. And this exposes the absolute most critical bottleneck in this entire blueprint, energy storage. To utilize that 53% capacity effectively, you have to capture the massive spike of solar power generated at noon and store it so you can discharge it at 8 p.m. when millions of people come home and turn on their air conditioners.
But doing that requires large-scale battery storage, which leads us directly into a massive geopolitical trap.
The supply chain vulnerability.
Exactly. The documents point out a heavy dependence on imported materials to build these batteries, specifically lithium.
Yeah.
If a nation transitions from being dependent on imported oil to being entirely dependent on imported lithium to keep its grid running, they haven't actually achieved strategic autonomy, have they? They've just swapped one massive vulnerability for another.
That is the dilemma keeping policymakers awake at night. If you don't have the lithium to build the batteries to store the solar power for when the sun goes down, what happens at 8 p.m.?
The lights go out.
Or you have to fall back on a steady, uninterrupted power source that doesn't care about the weather. You have to fall back on a baseload. And in India, that baseload is coal.
And there's the elephant in the room. The sources explicitly state that coal continues to account for nearly 75% of all electricity generation.
Yeah.
With all of this incredible green ambition, coal is still the undisputed king of the grid.
And you can see why. You cannot run a major hospital or operate a massive steel foundry on a power source that might dip dramatically just because a cloud rolls by.
Right.
Coal guarantees grid stability.
Right.
Furthermore, entire regional economies and millions of jobs are directly tied to the coal mining sector. A rapid, unmanaged phase-out of coal risks massive economic disruption. It is a terrifying socioeconomic tightrope.
And we haven't even touched on the physical limitations yet. Hitting that massive carbon sink target means planting millions of trees. Scaling up to 60% renewable capacity means building colossal solar and wind parks.
Which requires land.
The sources note severe land scarcity and acquisition hurdles. In a country as densely populated as India, it is a zero-sum game for space. You cannot just commandeer vast tracts of land for green infrastructure without risking the displacement of vital agriculture or local communities.
No, you can't. Every single solar farm requires a complex, highly sensitive negotiation over land rights and federal issues.
So let's pull all this together. If the domestic roadblocks are this immense, severe grid bottlenecks, a lack of lithium, an entrenched dependence on coal, and a zero-sum game for land.
Yeah.
Why is India pushing forward so aggressively on the global stage?
Because nature abhors a vacuum. And right now, there's a massive vacuum in global climate leadership. The sources highlight a major geopolitical shift happening. Several developed nations, the very countries that historically championed aggressive climate action, are currently experiencing a rollback on their policies.
Due to domestic inflation and political pressures.
Exactly.
And some of them are even imposing unilateral trade measures, like carbon border taxes.
If you are listening to this in the US or Europe, you might be wondering why India's domestic coal use matters to your daily life.
It absolutely matters. It matters because when the West imposes a carbon border tax, essentially charging tariffs on imported goods that were manufactured using dirty energy, it completely shifts the global supply chain. The price of your electronics, the cost of your car parts, everything you buy is going to be dictated by how fast India and the broader global South can green their manufacturing base to avoid those taxes.
And India recognizes that the global South is being heavily penalized by these unilateral taxes, while the West simultaneously rolls back its own domestic commitments.
Right.
That is exactly why India is stepping into the leadership role. They are demonstrating concrete multilateral commitment. They aren't just making domestic pledges, they are actively building international coalitions.
The sources emphasize initiatives like the International Solar Alliance, right?
The ISA, yes, and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the CDRI, and the Global Biofuel Alliance. They're actively building a bloc of allied nations to share technology and create geopolitical leverage.
But all of this ambition, the global alliances, the structural transition, the advanced technology, it all crashes into the final inescapable hurdle. The transition comes with a staggering price tag.
The finance gap.
The estimates suggest India requires massive investments of around 40 to 50 billion US dollars annually just to expand their clean energy infrastructure.
Annually. And They are facing this immense financial burden while global climate finance, the money historically promised by developed nations to help developing nations transition, it continues to be severely limited, heavily delayed, and highly uncertain.
So to summarize the sheer scale of this blueprint for you,
Yeah.
India is walking a razor-thin tightrope here.
Yeah.
On one side, they are pushing aggressive climate actions, setting massive targets, and claiming a real geopolitical leadership role for the global south. On the other side, they are wrestling with the harsh, unforgiving realities of maintaining their energy security, managing a 75% dependence on coal, trying to solve the physics of battery storage, and navigating a severe lack of international funding.
It's incredible.
They are essentially trying to build the gleaming high-tech house of the future while actively living in the old one, and they are largely having to figure out how to pay for it entirely themselves.
It is the ultimate test of state capacity and governance. They have to govern for today's basic survival while actively legislating for tomorrow's climate.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If the historical models of development relied almost entirely on cheap, dirty fossil fuels, and if global climate finance from the West continues to fall drastically short of what has been promised, will developing nations like India be forced to invent an entirely new, completely self-reliant model of green economic growth?
A model that the developed world never even had to consider during its own rise to power.
Exactly. That is the question that will define the global economy for the next decade.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the blueprints, keep looking at the mechanisms behind the headlines, and we'll catch you next time.